Hey everyone, I'm here joined once again with historian and YouTuber Christo Avalis. Christo, how's it going?
Great. Thanks for having me.
So I'm having you on today because, well, actually, you messaged me to want to talk about this, and I think
Yeah.
it's a great idea.
Yeah.
The discussion of what's happening in Bolivia and Canada's response to it, as well as historically Canada's response to Latin America. So first, I've done a video on it. You've done a video on it. Give me your summary of what's happened recently in Bolivia.
Yeah. So, I mean, you and I are just two voices. You'd want to read widely and watch widely on this, but I think we both have a general agreement that this was a coup, that this was a coup against a democratically elected and legitimate government, and that the coup was undertaken for a variety of reasons, but some of the biggest ones include the fact that, the kind of white elite in Bolivia didn't like having to share power with the indigenous majority there. They didn't like the fact that they had a socialist government and the lithium resources and other natural resources of Bolivia were, being kind of wrested away from international corporate control, especially Western corporations like those in Canada and the United States. And so that inside and outside of Bolivia, kind of the economic elite wanted to see a regime change, and they couldn't do it democratically, so they did it, through violence and through, a coup.
Yeah. So yeah, we're speaking, of course, of Evo Morales,
Yeah.
who is the president, the democratically elected president of Bolivia. The military asked him to resign. That's a coup. I mean, as you were saying,
Yeah.
he was threatened. His supporters were threatened.
Yeah.
An indigenous mayor in Bolivia was kidnapped and walked through the streets barefoot, covered in red paint, forcibly had her hair cut off. Just one example of
Yeah.
the sort of force that was being used against Morales and his supporters. So since this is an obvious coup, this should be an easy one for Canada, right? I mean, the Canadian government should be able to come out, call this what it is, a coup. The military asked Morales to leave. But what has Canada's reaction, the Canadian government's reaction, been to this coup in Bolivia?
Well, it's largely been to legitimize it. Now, Canada's a little bit more reluctant on this specific person, this Agnes woman who has become the president, quote unquote, whatever you want to call her, dictator, whatever, who has some pretty troubling views, even in relation to some other Latin American dictators. So there's been a reluctance to acknowledge her, but they've legitimized the coup, but they refuse to use that C word. They don't call it a coup. Very few people in the Canadian media are calling it a coup. Very few people in the Canadian political scene are acknowledging the fact that this was a coup, because we know coups are bad, they're anti-democratic, and we don't want to see what happened here as anti-democratic. And to me, this one is fairly black and white. All of the arguments I've heard from the anti-Morales forces are pretty easily dispatchable. And even though and there are other even grayer cases in, say, Latin America, what's happening in Brazil or what's happening in Venezuela. Here, Morales was very much a democratically elected and legitimate leader. And the fact that Canada's political consensus for the most part seems to be just accepting the fact that he was a tyrant, or that he quote unquote resigned and therefore he's not president anymore, even though, as you noted, when you're being threatened and your supporters are being threatened, that's not really a contract, an actionable contract of resignation. And it seems like Canada really wants people to believe that this was, the right thing that needed to happen, even if the lady in charge isn't a good person either.
Yeah. So before we get into also Canada's history in Latin America, what has the reaction to this coup been from other parties in Canada? Say, the NDP, the Green Party. What have their reactions been?
Well, for the most part, the consensus has been that this was a good thing. From most parties, the liberals and conservatives support actions like this. They support actions like this in Venezuela and in Central America. They've also, been generally supportive of the Bolsonaro regime in Brazil, despite his awful actions. The NDP was the only party to take a stand against the coup, to argue that there needs to be democratic legitimacy to the regime, that Morales did much good for his country, and that in a new election it must include Morales' party. And so they're the only ones acknowledging that what happened here was an assault on democracy. And whether or not they're 100% behind Morales or not, they're the only party that's done that. Surprisingly, at least potentially, with the Green Party, who came out a little bit later than the rest and basically took the side of the liberals, took the side of Donald Trump, took the side of the right-wing coup in Bolivia to argue that Morales was a dictator in the making, that he violated the democratic rights of Bolivians, that the Organization of American States, which is basically a right-wing, body, largely dominated by, corporate forces in Canada and the United States and in the right-wing regimes of Latin America, that their interpretation of the resignation was legitimate. And so the Greens have sort of just jumped right onto this, the supporting the coup train, which was a bit surprising to me. I thought that at the very least they would have stayed silent and maybe just tried to duck their heads on this issue. But yeah, so it was very troubling to me to see the Green Party take that stand, especially because they market themselves as a progressive, party, as a party that cares about the rights of indigenous people. And yet, as we see, I don't know if that's necessarily the case, at least on this particular case.
Yeah, and as a former Green candidate, I was disappointed in how the Green Party has reacted to this coup. On the NDP, though, so the NDP did eventually have a response. It was a little late. Yeah. What are your thoughts on how the NDP worded the response, or even how Jagmeet Singh worded his response, the NDP leader? What are your thoughts on his wording and maybe how you would change or improve how the NDP have taken this?
Yeah, I mean, so there was a lot of criticism about how Jagmeet didn't come out immediately to speak on this. Some of that is timing based. It came out on a Sunday night, and then the Monday was Remembrance Day. So I totally get why a party leader wouldn't want to make a statement on a Monday, Remembrance Day, and make it look like you're distracting. But then Tuesday came by, Wednesday came by, and we waited and waited for a statement, and it was unacceptable we waited that long. And I say that as an NDP member. We should have been quicker to show solidarity with Morales and with indigenous people in Bolivia, with trade unionists in Bolivia. And that was a real downside. The upside to the NDP is a lot of MPs, a lot of individual MPs came out fairly immediately. Matthew Green, Nikki Ashton, Leah Gazan, Don Davies, Alexandra Boulouris. I'm missing some, certainly. All sort of came out and stood in favor of the people of Bolivia, of Evo Morales, called it a coup, denounced it. Great to see. Singh's eventual remarks I thought were good. I think they could have been a little bit clearer that like the Morales has legitimacy. I think that they should have been a little bit clearer in noting that the movement for socialism is still the legitimately democratic government in Bolivia. But it's also hard because, as we recall, one of the moves Morales made in the last days before the coup really started rolling down the hill was say, let's do the election again. If you're so concerned about the legitimacy, let's hold another vote. We'll do it again. And of course, the coup backers didn't want that because they know they would have lost that election because Morales is not as universally popular as he was before, but he's still by far the most popular leader in that country. And so they knew the only way they would get rid of him is through violence and through thuggery, right? Yeah. And so I thought that should have been a little bit clearer to recognize that maybe there's not even an election needed. But on the whole, I think it was a good statement. It talked about, connecting this to the rights of indigenous people and things like that. And all of that was very good. And I mean, it's one of these things, too, because it's like they sort of win by default, right? Like the Greens had an awful statement. The Liberals had an awful statement. I don't even know if the Conservatives put anything out formally, but we can assume they're largely aligned with the Liberals.
Yeah, of course.
So it's like they sort of win by default, at least when compared to the parties that have seats in the House of Commons. Left-wing parties like the Communist Party in Canada often put out very progressive statements on these things, but they're very small and lack a lot of influence in electoral senses.
Yeah. So let's now extend this to Canada's history in Latin America. So the Liberal Party's approach to this coup is to essentially say the coup isn't a coup, and to legitimize or to at least open the window to legitimize the current takeover in Bolivia. How does this apply to Canada's approach to Latin America historically?
Well, Canada's approach has been generally to back the U.S., but not exclusively. So Canada, and that's similar to Canada's global policy sense. We usually sided with England most of the time, and then we sort of gradually shifted to U.S. being our focus, given that we're neighbors and given that, after World War II especially, the U.S. became the undisputed, world power with the exception of the Soviet Union. And so, Canada adopted a policy framework of usually backing the U.S., but we often showed some independence. So, for instance, Cuba is often seen as a mark of independence in Canada's foreign policy in Latin America. Canada is not necessarily an ally of Cuba, but whereas the U.S. has pressured a lot of its allies to embargo Cuba, to effectively make it a pariah on the international stage, Canada has maintained diplomatic relationships. This is the whole thing why Canadians have for a long time been able to travel to Cuba and Americans, except in rare circumstances, haven't really been able to, and how you can get Cuban goods in Canada, but you can't really in the United States until recently. That's that legacy, and that was Pierre Trudeau in a sense, taking a different policy framework than Richard Nixon and the American regime broadly defined. And if you go to Southern America, there are other examples where Canada sort of still backed the U.S. coup, but found like ways to show some independence. So, for instance, in Chile in 1973, Canada largely supported that coup. They weren't as boisterous about it as the Americans. And initially, they refused to accept refugees from Chile, a lot of socialist refugees. But due to the pressure of the NDP, due to a pressure of labor unions, and due to the pressure of many religious groups, eventually Canada relented and accepted those refugees. So there have been moments where Canada, through its refugee policy and through its policy of recognition, has tried to show some distinction from the U.S., but more often than not, Canada's goal is to back American policy. And it all comes down to the fact that, for the most part, Canada has the same broad, imperialist interests that the United States do in terms of a broad, global capitalism. Canada has a friendlier face than the United States or Britain or France, let's say, but Canada is a G7 country with the same basic interests as those traditional colonial powers. And over the last few decades especially, Canadian mining companies and Canadian companies of all sorts have made real headways into Latin America. So it's often been the case that right-wing regimes that oppose indigenous rights, environmental rights, workers' rights in Latin America become very popular with certain elements of Canada's capitalist class, because if the people of Bolivia want to own their resources, and if the indigenous people of Bolivia want to protect their traditional lands, and if the working class of Bolivia wants to be paid good wages and have unions and have health and safety, all that does is cut into the bottom line of Canadian corporations. You see similar things in Brazil. I mean, I don't know if you noted this on your channel, but I know that you saw this. But when Bolsonaro came to power in Brazil, the Canadian Broadcast Corporation focused much more on the investment opportunities that could come for Canadians than the potential damage this could do to the Amazon or to indigenous people or to workers or to LGBTQ people and so on and on and on. Canada's interests in the region are largely the interests of our mining companies. And because of that, we often side with anti-democratic forces if those forces are going to, raise the stock value of our corporations. And similar things with the United States as well, I assume.
Yeah. So, and we've seen Canada work closely with the U.S. and France when it came to Haiti, the coup in Haiti in 2004,
Yes.
and then most recently in Venezuela, Canada being all in when it came to Guaido taking over there. So there really is this pattern of behavior of Canada. I mean, Canada not willing to rebuke what I guess the consensus or the status quo is, and largely, as you say, because of capitalism, because of Canadian interests abroad. It always comes down to, well, how are we going to financially or capital-wise, who's going to benefit from this situation and who's not going to benefit? And if you have a coup that may benefit Canada financially, when it comes down to the bottom line and these massive corporations, that's who they give into. So you're seeing this now again, as you say, with Bolivia. I guess, I mean, where do we go from here? Like, what is the course of action that Canadians can take to really show that this is not what we want out of our foreign policy, out of Canada? How do Canadians show that we want a foreign policy based in human rights, based in facts on the ground in these various countries? What can Canadians do to really help the situation?
I mean, it's a tricky one, right? Because, I mean, even if we had like a better electoral system, you and I have talked about this a lot, first past the post system, it's broken. And, you know, it just leads to the conservative liberal duopoly. And as we know that there are differences between the conservatives and liberals, but on foreign policy, they are usually very, very much united. You know, at the end of the day, what we see here is that, you know, the vast majority of the Canadian political parties seem to back this coup. And I think what we need to do is show support to the party, I guess in this case, that does, you know, support democratic rights in Bolivia. But more than that, because this is about more than electoral politics, I think it's about, you know, building the bonds of solidarity, working within those grassroots organizations and within those social justice organizations that want to see, justice for people in that country. So in Bolivia and in Venezuela and Brazil, so like labor unions, for instance, it was rather interesting because the AFL-CIO in the United States stood with stood against the coup, and often the AFL-CIO historically has sort of backed American imperialism in Latin America, but they've taken a more progressive stance, and I think that international solidarity is key. You know, Morales would be dead right now if Mexico's president did not take him in. He would be dead right now. I really believe that. Or worse, he'd be tortured or what have you. Like, I don't even know if that's worse, but you know what I mean? Like, it would be this really troubling scenario. And you need these like bonds of solidarity. So, you know, more cooperation between Bernie Sanders and Jagmeet Singh and between both of them and the socialist movement in Mexico. And Jeremy Corbyn also came out and spoke against the coup. He was one of the quickest leaders I saw, at least in the Anglosphere, to come out and speak out against this. And the president, the new incoming government in Argentina, which is more left-leaning, has been critical of what's happening. And I think, frankly, that's what we need to do, is build the bonds of left-wing, you know, solidarity. And I think in Canada, we have to use this as yet another example to show people just how Justin Trudeau isn't really a progressive. And I think this has a crucial hook that makes it more applicable to Canada than even other coups, because this is directly an attack on indigeneity. You've seen the images. Like, you know, the Bolivia sort of has the dual flag. They have the traditional Bolivian flag, but also a flag that represents the indigenous people of the country. And in light of this coup, that flag has been burnt. It's been stomped on. Military and police officials have been cutting it off their uniforms as a rejection of indigenous equality in the country. And so this is, you know, even more a clear case that you cannot say you're for reconciliation here in Canada with the First Nations of this country if you support the colonialism and murder and dispossession of indigenous peoples in Latin America. And the same thing goes with Brazil. I mean, Bolsonaro, who is a core ally of Trudeau and Freeland, especially as it comes to Venezuela and Bolivia and things like that, has basically pledged to destroy indigenous people in Brazil. You know, basically that's his goal. Like, you know, to basically wipe out indigenous communities, to take away their right to land. And like, that's one of his visions for, you know, a right-wing Brazil. And Canada endorses that. And so I think we need to, you know, hammer home that, like, you can't support indigenous people here in Canada if you're going to attack indigenous people in Latin America. And the same question has to be raised to the Green Party as well, who's faced a lot of concerns recently over how they've been sort of ignorant on indigenous issues, and this won't help them.
Yeah. And just to put a topper on it here, I think this case in Bolivia really shows you that Canada has been on the wrong side of history for a while when it comes to these coups all around the world, especially in Latin America, where Canada has been involved. So thanks, Christo, for joining me. Is there anything else you want to add before we go here?
No, this was great. Thanks for having me. Always great to be on the show.
Yeah.
You know, you find me on YouTube, find me on Twitter, find me on Facebook. Yeah.
I'll have all links to Christo's channel below the video. I'll also link to Christo's video on what happened in Bolivia, so check out his take on that. And thanks again for joining me, and I'm looking forward to the next conversation.
Thanks again.